This show is brought to you by Celltech MD, the leader in regenerative medicine, balancing your body from the inside out. Tom,
What's up, brother?
what is up, man?
Not much, not much. How you doing?
Not too bad, not too bad, man. I'm here in the gallows of the Townhouse of Terror. We've got the Five Nights at Freddy's sign with my casting couch behind me. That looks a little ominous, actually, now that I'm looking at it.
It's a little weird, not gonna lie.
I like you though. You're all like, it's like bokeh out. Like it looks like you're in heaven or something.
It's a filter, man. It's just
Yeah,
a filter. It just blurs out the background so you don't get to see the mess behind me.
yeah. So you don't see all the crazy illegal things going on behind you.
No, there's no illegal. I'm the only one home. It just couch is a mess, dogs making fun of it.
So, well, we've seen each other and done a podcast here recently, with Better Than Broadway, right? On
Yes,
the
sir.
on the wrestling front, which if you're listening to this and you have not heard of that yet, go check that out. It's Ryan, and Rob are doing that. I've done it quite a bit too. I've had to take a step back just from busyness, but I hope to get back on there pretty soon. But Tom and I are both really big wrestling, what should we say? Aficionados, nerds,
I'd say nerds. I would
nerds.
not. I would not put myself as aficionado. You
Is it?
guys know way more about the ins and outs of the industry
I
than
haven't
I
even
do.
had a chance to listen to it or watch it, man. It's been months. I watched Survivor Series and then
I
I
mean,
watched Monday Night Raw, and that's it. It's been months since I've seen anything. How about you?
oh, it's been years. Like I watch like a couple pay-per-views if I know I'm going to be on Better Than Broadway. But like other than that, I have watched zero AEW pay-per-views. I think I've watched two full episodes of AEW. I don't watch any of the other promotions. The last pay-per-view for WWE that I watched probably was WrestleMania.
Oh, so you didn't watch Survivor Series?
I haven't watched it yet.
Did
I
you
was
did you pick up the things from Raw?
Oh, I
Because
mean like we had talked about the stuff from like amongst various conversations. Like I just laughed because everything that I thought was going to happen did happen when they needed another teammate. I'm like, Cody's gonna call Orton. I
yeah,
was like, and Punk's gonna somehow get worked into it because it was in Chicago and everything like that. And everybody's like, no, he's not going to WWE. I'm like, listen, he's going to fucking WWE. He's not gonna go after dealing with the whole AEW stint. He's not gonna go anywhere else. He's not gonna go anywhere
yeah,
less.
yeah. He won't go
Uh,
anywhere else, and it
because
makes sense because Vince isn't necessarily the top. You know what I mean? If it's going to
yeah,
happen, now would be the time to happen. I will say this though, because I did watch Survivor Series, and we'll get off of wrestling after this, but
yeah,
um, you know. I think they did a good job because everybody obviously was talking Punk because it was in Chicago, and CM Punk is Chicago native. He's the hometown hero. But to quell that, they basically said, no, it's Orton, right? So they didn't
yeah.
do a surprise visit. It was Orton. And then when you saw Orton, you're like, and it kind of took everybody's mind off. I was like, oh, okay, well, but then when he showed up at the very end, obviously they did both. It's like the best of both worlds. And, I don't know. We'll see. His promo on Monday night, I got a chance to listen to it. And I mean, it was pretty bland. It sounds like it was maybe scripted. I mean, he's
Yeah,
always,
I didn't hear I didn't watch any of the promos and stuff like that. Like I saw some of the highlights, but that was about it.
yeah, he only had like 8 minutes at the end. They really pushed the show, which they promoted it hard for him to be on there. So I'm surprised they didn't give him more time. But Orton,
Yeah,
it was his first match back, and they went on right after Orton. So,
gotcha.
but it was good. I mean, he said I'm home, which
Yeah,
feels a little forced. You know what I mean? I mean, as much shit as he talked about it or whatever, but we'll see what happens. I think a lot of the people are not happy about him being there at all. But I think there's like some room for some big money to be made because Seth Rollins has just gone on record as saying he's a cancer and he's a piece of crap. And like that to me seems like the obvious go-to for WrestleMania for him against the title, for the
Y-
title.
yeah. I mean, it's just one of those things where like I feel like you can't help but admit that he's gonna or like acknowledge that he's a needle mover. And Rollins has also been on record saying though, like even though he doesn't particularly care for the guy, like if it's gonna make money, like he'll work a program with him. So I think the Rollins stuff was a little bit of a work, but like at the end of the day. I think he needs WWE more than WWE needs him. So hopefully he keeps his antics at bay because if he doesn't, I think he's going to be out on his ass without a job. And literally, if WWE lets him go a second time because he's being a douche, nobody is going to want to touch him with a 10-foot pole.
No. Yeah, he would be I think he's done after that if this doesn't work out.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're right. Rollins is a company guy, right? So like
Yeah.
he's going to do what's best for business.
Yeah.
But I think it's definitely a real life thing. I think it's definitely like a Shawn Michaels Bret Hart type thing where
Oh,
like it's
100%.
they really do not like each other for whatever reason, or at least Seth doesn't like Punk. I mean, look, when Punk left, he was in he was going against the Shield, and now they've broken up. And if you want to talk about long-term storytelling, when he fought Moxley in AEW, he made a comment about like, I'm going against you're not even the best guy from the Shield. You're the third best guy in the
Yeah.
Blackpool Combat Club, and you were the third best guy in the Shield. So he went against Moxley, and now I think, he's going against the second best guy in the Shield, or at least by company standards in Rollins. And then, it stands to reason that he would go after Reigns after that. Apparently, those are the two big first feuds for him. So they're kind of shooting
Yeah.
them all the way to the top, it looks like. But I want to talk about strength, conditioning, fitness stuff because we haven't
Let's
talked
do
about
it.
that in a minute. And you've got a lot of stuff going on. You've had a lot of stuff going on. If anybody on here hasn't seen your podcast, or well, you used to do a podcast actually.
These two
Yeah,
podcasts. Yeah.
yeah.
I haven't done it yet.
If they haven't seen you on any of my podcasts before, we've done quite a few before. Tell them a little bit about what it is that you do because you're doing still Highland Games stuff, right?
I do a little bit of everything. I mean, I am still coaching Olympic weightlifting. That is still like my biggest piece of my business, but I've since like expanded that and I kind of work with like um all strength sports in particular. So like I have, I've got about 11 or 12 Highland Games athletes that I coach and do their programming and guidance for now. I've got like 5 or 6 power lifters. I've got another like 5 or 6 strongmen that I work with. Me personally, yeah, like the Highland Games is like my main thing. I'm technically a professional in that sport. Like I'm on the pro circuit. So I get to, spend my summers, traveling around to games that'll pay me to come out and throw and entertain the crowd and stuff like that. I do strongman from time to time. Like I got really into strongman during COVID just because there wasn't anything really going on. And for some reason, strongman was still happening, even though Highland Games wasn't. Um, did, moderately well at that. Um, but I had to kind of take like a half a year off of everything from like my surgery and stuff like that last year. And so last year was the first year I kind of got back into strongman. Did nationals last year, did all right. I'm not gonna sit here and like try to make it better than it was or anything like that. But it's just one of those deals. Like I'll probably do strongman from time to time, but it's not like my main focus. Highland Games is my focus. Um, I've had I've had a couple people from like the old Moss wrestling community kind of reach out and ask if I was going to be competing again or anything like those. Like I don't have any intentions of doing Moss wrestling anytime soon, but I've done
So,
that
so let me
before.
let me stop you there. So explain the difference for people who don't know the difference between the Highland Games and strongman.
The big difference. Do you want the clean version or do you want
Fuck it, dude.
the
We're already or we're already rated R. So it's
one version is completely drugged out of their minds. The other version is not to an extent. But
are
no,
you drug tested in the Highland Games? Is it drug tested?
in the men's pro side, we are drug tested at nationals and worlds.
Okay. Well, that's
Um,
that's that's more than strongman. So you're right.
I'm well aware. Listen, I've had people try to tell me that they drug test that strongman, and when I try to explain to them that they drug test for things like methamphetamine and cocaine and not
Yeah.
PEDs,
Yeah.
they roll their eyes at me. But anyways, but no, biggest difference between Highland Games and strongman is they're very similar in terms of like from like a coaching athlete standpoint that like you have a script essentially that you have to follow. Like leading up to a strongman competition, you know the events, you know the weights, but it's not like weightlifting where you get to choose your barrier of entry. Strongman, you have a set barrier of entry. You can either do the events or you cannot do the events. And so you literally spend however long it is, 2, 3 months preparing for these events. You know the weights and all this stuff. And so it's just a script that you're continually trying to build up to and beyond to work on. Highland Games is very similar, except for the fact that, in my opinion, Highland Games is tougher than Strongman. And I only say that because of the frequency of the competitions in which you compete, the duration of the season, which because of social media and all that stuff has gotten a lot longer. And on top of that, just the number of events. So in a typical strongman competition, you're doing anything from like 4 to 5 events. Yes, the events are a lot, or like 4 to 6 events. Yes, the events are a lot heavier, but you get big breaks in between events and stuff like that. Obviously, there's certain shows that are outliers like Clash and all those other shows where they try to like get the show done in like 2 hours, which is incredible. Um, but like for the most part, you're getting a break between these like heavy events and like you've got time to prepare for them and things like that. Highland Games, you have anywhere from 7 to 9 throwing events. It's an all-day affair. So you have to be conditioned for both. Just it's a different type of conditioning. Whereas like strongman, like you have to be over the top in terms of like your muscles need to be able to handle that abuse over and over and over again in that short amount of time. Whereas like the Highland Games, you need to be able to be like a dimmer switch where you kind of crank it up a little bit for a brief few seconds, then you got to turn it back down again for 5 to 10 minutes, then crank it back up again, and so on and so forth. You need to be able to do that all day long. Like a strongman competition, there are a lot of guys out there that compete way too much. I feel like I feel like and I feel like that's what's led to a lot of like the excessive PED use in strongman is they're just trying to keep up with the Joneses and be able to do the next show and the next event and stuff like that. But like it still pales in comparison to Highland Games. Highland Games, a very competitive pro will throw anywhere from like 12 to 15 games a season. And the season starts as early as now, like last year, for instance, like I had a long season. Like last year, I threw in, I think, 11 games. First games was the first weekend in March. Last games was the first weekend in November. Like, and that's a really long season to be up for it. Now, I will admit, I did take breaks in between there. Like, I did Strongman Nationals, which was in October. So, like, I didn't throw for almost like 8 weeks at one point because I put the throwing implements aside and was focusing on training for nationals and stuff like that. But like the Highland Games season itself is just it's a very long season, and it's one of those things where because all the events are so technically based, and they're light, comparatively speaking. Like the heaviest thing we throw is usually going to be the K toss, which is anywhere from like 100 to 150 pounds on average. And you're doing, 6, 7, 800 pound deadlifts. Like it's not comparable, but they do have their own like nuances and stuff like that that you got to be like you can't muscle anything in the Highland Games really. You'll get to a certain point where you can muscle things, but once you get to that point, like you need to actually learn how to do it the right way. Whereas strongman, I feel like you can continually learn how to muscle things through weak points, through disadvantages and stuff along those lines. And that's just my opinion. Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
there are gonna be people that'll get their panties in a bunch when they hear that. But like
Well,
that's just my viewpoint on it
well,
from a
I was gonna
technical standpoint.
say, I was gonna say that I think that from my perspective on the outside looking in, I would say that yeah, like I would think strongman is a little bit more heavy, but I feel like Highland Games is more athletic, right? Like you're
Yeah,
saying, it's all
it
explosive.
it can be. Yeah, like let me put it this way: if you take two other sports, like if you were to take a thrower, they would transition into the Highland Games very, very well. But if you take like a power lifter or a strongman, try to transition them into the Highland Games, not so much. They're gonna be very clunky. They're gonna be very stiff. They're gonna be very rigid in their movement. Whereas vice versa, if you took a seasoned and I'm not talking like your run of the mill guy who just like says they do the Highland Games because they like to wear the kilt and cosplay and all that stuff.
They like go to like medieval times or whatever,
Dude, don't even get me
or the
started.
fairs or whatever.
Yeah, the Ren fairs are an
Yeah, Ren
interesting.
fairs. Yeah, yeah.
The Ren fairs are an interesting time in and of itself. Don't even get me started on that. But but no, like, but if you took a seasoned competitive pro in the Highland Games, they would transition over to strongman a lot better. Like they would just need to get comfortable with the events and stuff like that, but they'd be able to adapt. Like I have said this multiple times, and some people agree with me, some people don't, that I can go to a weightlifting meet and I can take a top level national level lifter, and I'm talking top level like in that 5 to 10 range placing wise. I could take them, and if you gave me a year, they would be a force to be reckoned with on the strongman national scene. Now, what they
Hmm.
do from there is, that's up to them. But like they're like case in point, there's a girl, she's one of Travis Mash's lifters, Sarah Johnson. She's weightlifted for years. I believe she's been on the podium a couple times in different weight classes and stuff like that. Mostly in the 76, I believe. But she just won the 73 kilo nationals this past year at Strongman. And she's literally done that was her second or maybe even her third competition. She just transitioned very well over. She was a very strong, being one of Mash's athletes, they're always very strong and stuff like that. But you couple that with her athletic background in terms of the Olympic weightlifting, and it was just a seamless transition from it. And me and a bunch of other people had been telling her for years that she should give strongman a try. I don't know. There's a lot of my weightlifters who were just kind of like looking for something else to do because they had kind of just like fizzled out with weightlifting. I was able to successfully get them to switch over to strongman and have a pretty good go at it. Meanwhile, I've had powerlifters do the same, and they did not have as much of early on success as like the people that transitioned over from like weightlifting or throwing or something like that.
So what I'm hearing is that okay, so all bourbon is whiskey, right?
Yep,
But not all whiskey is bourbon.
exactly.
So you're telling me that the Highland Games is bourbon
Yep,
and strongman is whiskey.
yep.
I like
But
it.
don't get me wrong, the guys that are at the top, they are the cream of the crop for a reason. And it's not and everybody likes to point at drugs and this and stuff like that. But you know what? Like those dudes got something off in their head to be able to do what they do on a year in and year out basis and just put it like you look at somebody like Brian Shaw. Like he has a genetic skill set that
Six
you and
eight,
I,
six
yeah,
nine, four
that
hundred
you
pounds.
that you and I are never going to he gets to play with a deck of cards that you and I can't even purchase.
Yeah.
And but like those guys at the top, they are freaks. They are gifted. They are, like I said, like the cream of the crop. They have that craft down to a science. So I do hate when people try to just say, well, if you just take enough drugs, like you'll be good at strongman. Okay,
Well,
then do it.
that's like saying, oh, if I took that many drugs, I could be Mr. Olympia. No, you can't.
Exactly,
You have to
exactly,
work.
exactly.
You not only have to work as hard, you have to work as hard as you possibly can and have
Yep.
no stone turned unturned, but you also have to have the genetics.
I
And so
would I
yeah,
would equate bodybuilding and strongman in terms of mentality very similar.
yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. I mean, you're preaching to the choir as far as that goes. People all the time want to use drugs as an excuse and this and that or whatever. And the bottom line is that the people that say that they've never done it and they could take all the drugs in the world and they would never be anything either, right? And they don't understand how many people at their local gym are geared and gassed up on ridiculous amounts of anabolics that they don't even look like they work out. So to say that that's all you have to do is completely asinine and you're just showing your own ignorance. But that's like a whole nother topic, right? So Highland Games, you've done at a high level at that. I had no idea that they competed that much. That's
Yeah.
freaking crazy.
Yeah,
Like,
there's a guy back
how
in
do
the
you
day.
periodize your training for that? Because like if you
You
got
really
what like
don't.
you got a competition every other week or something.
Well, and that's kind of how I got into coaching for the Highland Games was because like early on, if you've ever like competed in track and field, similar concept. Like track and field, you are competing almost every weekend. You have a track meet and stuff like that. And the goal in track and field was you usually picked like two points that you were working towards. Everything else was just practice for that point. And so that's kind of how I have taken the approach to working with like my Highland Games athletes is like right now we are in our off season. Our off season, we are trying to build as big of a base, both conditioning, muscular endurance, and muscular strength wise, to be able to handle the grueling rigors of not only like the competition day itself and the season, but the practices. Because the practices, you need to be able to get, anywhere from like 15 to 20 throws in a practice and do that 2 to 3 times a week, plus get your lifting done, which is another 2 to 3 times a week. So like you need to be in shape to do that. And that's kind of one of the things that I notice as a glaring weakness. Matt Vincent kind of started this off with his group and stuff like that back in the day. And then I've kind of just taken it and put my own twist on it from things that I've learned from other coaches and mentors in the sport and stuff like that. And I've tried to just kind of create a nice little neat package. But essentially, what I do is I sit down with every one of my athletes and I'm like, okay, I need one or two competitions that are going to be your focal point. Everything else is just like we're
Noise.
focusing on just maintaining. And so that's the other thing too is like a lot of guys get caught up in the numbers. It's like, well, I threw this, well, I throw this. It's like, okay, well, if you throw, like you take an implement like the lightweight for distance, 80 feet is like the magical barrier. If are over an 80 foot, like you are in some rare air. But me personally, I'd rather be throwing 76, 77, 78 on a consistent week to week basis instead of having an 80-foot plus throw than a 75-foot throw, then like another 80-foot throw, and then maybe barely breaking 70 feet. And that's kind of like the twist that I've brought to it in terms of working with my lifter or my athletes and my lifters and stuff like that. It's just trying to teach them that it's consistency over the period of time instead of focusing on like the big number all the time, because that big number, like any you know this with power output, like you can't focus on the big number all the time, otherwise you're going to burn out your central nervous system. So it's being able to leave a little bit of room in the tank, knowing what an 80% throw feels like, knowing what a 90% throw feels like, and then know when you have to turn on the gas and put something out there because you need the extra points throughout the day.
Yeah, you want your 80% as high as you possibly can, right? And it's a
Right.
different, like in weightlifting, it's you see it all the time. The guys that go into the gym, and heck, I was one of them. The guys that they'll put their gym PRs up there, and in the perfect environment here and there, you have 12 misses, and all of a sudden you get that one lift, and it's really impressive for the gram. It's the same thing as, but how many times are you able to repeat that, and how much of a percentage of out of, let's say, 20 lifts, if you go for that attempt 20 times, how many times are you going to make that accuracy? How efficient are you at that? And I mean, it sounds
Right,
like
exactly.
you're trying to increase their 80% as high as you possibly can, which makes sense in a sport like that. It's the
Yeah.
same way in I mean, in football or any other, more athletic sports, is like you're just trying to keep them not injured, right? And you're trying
Yeah.
to make sure that you have them be able to consistently perform at the same time, which makes sense. It's crazy. What do the movements look like that you give your people, if you don't mind pulling the curtain back a little bit?
No,
Like, what does
absolutely.
a workout look like in the off season to get this? I guess you're kind of looking at like general physical preparedness, right?
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, like the main staples exercise wise for upper body pushing exercise, we do bench press. I'm not a huge proponent of bench press, but it serves its purpose. Um, Bench press, strict press, push press. Those are the big three upper body, exercises. Lower body, sumo deadlift, box squat, back squat slash front squat, whatever you prefer to do. And then Olympic lifting variations, cleaner snatch high pulls and muscle snatches. I do like hip snatches too, but like not everybody has a really like I don't want to teach people how to swing the bar out in front of them. And some people we just don't have enough time to really work on the nuances. So like I feel like muscle snatches from any height, hang or from the floor, clean high pulls where you're putting like a PVC pipe or something like that for them to pull up into. You get that same extension effect. It's not going to like completely replace the lifts, but it's going to help create that horsepower. And then you start like adding in like I try to do a lot of accessory work in terms of the shoulders, the triceps, the upper back, the core, and the hamstrings, because most people I run into, they're very quad dominant and they're always complaining about knee pain and stuff like that, and their posterior chains are weak as shit. A lot of med ball throws, a lot of plyometrics, stuff like
Mm.
that. So like right now, the first like 4 weeks of my off season stuff is we're doing AMRAPs, 5 minute AMRAPs. You pick two exercises at like 50 to 60% intensity, and you run the couplet. So like one of the ones that I did yesterday actually was a behind the neck push press and a ring row. And it's just 5 minutes going back and forth between those two exercises, just trying to accumulate as many reps as possible without burning out in the
That
5 minutes.
sounds that sounds horrible.
Yeah. It's not fun. And
it
then like,
sounds it sounds like the exact thing that you want to do to immediately take a picture afterwards for your pump.
oh,
It's like
100%,
full
100%.
upper body pump.
Yeah, the pump is great. And then like my lower body one I got later this week is sumo deadlifts and heavy slam balls. Like just back and forth between those two. We do like 2 to 3 rounds of that. And then once that 4 week block conditioning block is done, because most of the guys are pretty beat up. So it just kind of gives you that wiggle room to kind of do things, but not push the intensity too much, but you're still moving around, getting that blood flowing and stuff. And then we'll go into like volume work. And I give my guys a couple different options of what they can do, but it's essentially kind of like German volume training 5-3-1 type stuff where it's like you start, wide and then start to narrow it down. And then as we get closer to the season, we do a lot of contrast stuff where like they will do like a heavy, chain or bench or a chain or banded bench press into like a med ball chest pass or something like that. Like just like boom, boom. We're tracking velocity on that stuff too, because that's one thing that I feel like is very underutilized. I think it's overutilized in weightlifting personally, but that's just my own
And
personal
how do you
opinion.
track that velocity?
So I use an app called Iron Path. There's all sorts of tools and stuff like that that you can do, but essentially you just need to be able to attach something to the end of a barbell, and it just tracks the speed of the bar. The reason I don't like it for Olympic weightlifting is because the bar path has too many moving points.
Yeah.
Velocity works best in just like straight lines. Outside of that, like I feel like you start to get a little bit of skewed data, but there are people that would argue with me, and there are people that have had success with it. So if they're having success with it, good with them. But like I've never had much success with my lifters, but like my throwers, I've had a lot of success with tracking bar speed and stuff like that. And then we obviously, I operate with like various levels of like speed strength versus strength speed. Max effort work, I try to keep between, zero point 0.3 and zero point 0.6 meters per second, which is sounds slow, but it's actually not as slow as you would think. Um, think of like a grindy rep on like a 1 rep max. That's usually going to be anywhere from like zero point 0.2 to zero point 0.3 meters per second. And then for like more dynamic, explosive movements or like lighter percentage stuff, we try to keep it between zero point 0.8 or 1 meter per second, which is like pretty dang fast when you're like going through it. And I just like it because like it dictates when you can add weight and it dictates how your body's responding. So
I was about to say, are you using that more of a barometer of how fried their nervous system is and like how
I,
their power, almost like we would use like a vertical to see
yeah,
like
yeah,
where we're
pretty
at. Yeah.
much. Yeah. Like at the end of the day, like it's just one of those situations where like take like let's say we're doing like a sumo a max effort deadlift. And the goal is to be between zero point 0.3 and zero point 0.6. If like as you're building up in weight, if you're hitting like 1 meter per second, zero point 0.8, zero point 0.7, whatever, you need to obviously be adding, 20, 30 pounds, 40 pounds almost each attempt. Then once you get like into that range, you're just going to keep slowly adding a little bit of weight until you start to fall out of that range. And then once you pull out of that zero point 0.3, you're done for the day. Whether you feel like you could do another rep or not is not the point. Like it's that you can't do another rep within the prescribed range that you were given.
Yeah.
And it just
No,
I feel like especially and I feel like that helps go back to the original point of being consistent and being able to maintain over a period of time. Like you live to fight another day.
yeah. I like that idea better, that approach from a scientific standpoint better than like say an RPE, right? Because you're
I
not
I I,
basically
per-
it's
I personally can't stand RPE because
yeah, well,
it,
you're relying up here, right? And everybody's different, so but this, these are more, it's much more scientific. It's like, no, you have to do this. But
yeah,
what's cool, the kind of the same thing happens though, right? Because if you're operating at, if this is a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10 for you or whatever, you're not going to be able to maintain that for a long time. It's going to fall off. So that makes total sense, man. Yeah, you're really, really hitting it from a scientific standpoint. Like, when did you start doing this? And is this something that you said you kind of adopted from when you were doing it and from some people that came before you, or is this
yeah,
just something that you've done because you've done high level Olympic weightlifting with Team
yeah,
Muscle Driver back in the day,
yeah.
and then like you said, you've done a bunch of different sports, and you actually work. Are you still teaching at a school? Is that right?
No, not at the school.
Or
I
you're
live
not at
out
the
in
school anymore?
No, that was when I was living in Chicago. I live in Raleigh now, so I'm not
Okay,
teaching currently. I'm just running
okay.
my business. Um, Yeah, so it was one of those deals like I did the Highland Games first before I did the Olympic weightlifting. We had kind of played around with certain velocity stuff in college. The guy who kind of like took us under his wing and kind of trained us and taught us, like he introduced conjugate and the West Side method to us at first. And so that was my first experience with bands and chains and all of that stuff. And like learning how to move with intent. And then every once in a while, he had like the really fancy like Tendo unit, which are they're like $2,000 or something like that. And he would pull it out, and we would do high pulls and stuff like that. And we would, we started working on, horsepower in that regards in terms of doing like various like pull variations and stuff like that, and just measuring our wattage that we were putting out. Had no clue what it meant. All we knew is that like if you had the higher number, you were pulling a certain weight faster. So if you not only pulled more weight than your buddies, but the wattage number was higher, you were like, ha ha ha, I'm better than you. Um, but we didn't really understand like how it applied. And then once I started getting into the Highland game season, I would get to this point where like I would like back in that time, Highland games started usually around like end of May, June. And but by the time I would get to August, like because my season would usually end like September, October, but I would get to August and I feel like I had hit a wall. Like I just wasn't, I felt like everything was hard. I was slow. It was this, I was that. And so I had a buddy of mine who I was traveling around with, seeing him at a lot of competitions and stuff like that. And he started talking to me about like velocity based stuff. And it was kind of starting to make its rounds. There was a guy, John Gallagher. I believe he was a throws coach and strength coach at Kent State. He was a Highland Games thrower. He was posting a lot about it. Craig Smith, who was like one of the top pros at the time, was using it. And there's this little device called the Power Factor that everybody was purchasing. And so my buddy had one. He was kind of explaining to me how he was incorporating it. And so like the next year, he and I literally just put together a program for both of us to follow that like utilize this. And like I had hands down like my best season ever. And I was like, okay, well, there's some merit to this. And then I started training with Glenn, learning more about the Olympic lifts and stuff like that. I got to travel a little bit, talk to more people about the conjugate method, and learning more about conjugate, not just the West Side method, but talking about conjugate and all its nuances and stuff like that. And so just over this course of time, when I got back to the Highland Games, I just like I forgot about the velocity stuff for a long time. And I was just like, okay, like periodize this, periodize that, go, 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 go. And then in my off season, I would just run conjugate, max effort, dynamic effort. And as long as the bands were moving, I was good to go. And then all of a sudden I found a notebook of like this program and I was looking through it and I'm like, oh yeah, I used to do this. So like I kind of ran it again with some athletes. I wasn't even throwing at the time. I was just coaching a guy and I was writing his workouts for him. And he was a high school thrower. And I was like, okay, this is what we're going to do and stuff like that. And we did it in the gym and he had a really good season. He made huge progress. So then I just threw it out there on social media one day. I was like, hey, any Highland Games guys? Like I was coming getting back into the Highland Games myself, but I was kind of like part-time in it. But I was like, hey, any Highland Games guys that, want to work with me, like this is something that I offer, like let me know. And I had like a handful of guys. One of them is still with me to this day, and I just had success and it's just grown every year. Like every year I've added like two or three guys or girls, and like they've ended up having like some of their best seasons and best consistency in terms of a season and stuff. And so it's just kind of grown from there. And every year I learn and evolve the program a little bit more. So it helps out a ton.
Okay, yeah. As we're winding down here, we got about
Yeah.
5 more minutes before we got to go or whatever. But I had a couple questions for you. The first one, I was going to ask this earlier, and you haven't mentioned it or not.
Mhm.
I'm only asked this because I trained under John Coffey, who I know you're familiar with, and he trained a lot of throwers. And he said something to me that I had trouble understanding. But he used close grip muscle snatch a lot.
Yeah,
Have you ever used that in your throwing? And if
I
so, do
have.
you
I
find it
have.
being effective? Or because I
I
mean,
find.
he's obviously he's one of the best weightlifting coaches
Yeah.
to ever exist, but obviously he's also not necessarily a throwing coach. What is the
I
reasoning behind that?
so the bigger the big thing behind it is you take an event like the hammer throw. Hammer throw, you just have a very long range of motion in terms of your extension. Honestly, like something like a close grip muscle snatch would cover an event. It would cover an event like the heavy weight for height, the weight toss for height, the caber toss, the sheaf, and the hammers. Just that long extension and that keeping the hips open. The biggest thing that I always see is people who are like myself included. Once I could snatch like 335 pounds, I was like, oh, I'm gonna crush weight for height. But like what I was noticing was like I would hit the top of my extension and I was pulling myself back under
You're thinking
after I
about the
let
third
go.
pull. Yeah, you're thinking
Yeah.
about the third pull.
And
So you
so
need your
like
muscles. Yeah.
and so muscle snatches just teaches you to stay long on that extension. Close grip is just a little more specific. The only reason I don't use it too much is because, like I said, I get a lot of guys that are coming from like a strongman or a powerlifting background,
That's
and
what I
they
was
just
gonna
don't
say.
they just don't have the overhead mobility to be able
Yeah.
to do it. Like I even have decent mobility for a strongman or a powerlifter type, but like I even struggle. Like my close grip, your close grip should be somewhere around like shoulder width. My close grip would be almost like in between like a snatch grip and like your clean grip, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
And so,
well, when your lats are like the wingspan of a fucking 747 jet, it
yeah,
doesn't matter. Like it's just it
yeah.
stops. You know what I
So
mean?
like, so I will tell guys, like, especially on like muscle snatches, like get your snatch grip, but then bring your hands in about like 2 to 3 spaces.
Yeah.
and go from there, just to kind of as a happy medium. But yeah, like close grip muscle snatches is definitely an exercise that is utilized a lot in throwing and stuff like that. Um, yeah, it's a good exercise. I've never actually had the chance to talk to John Coffey, but I heard that he had a pretty good, solid group of throwers, and he worked with a lot of the throws coaches down in that area at like University of Florida, Don Babbitt at Georgia. I'm drawing a blank on the guy that was at LSU for a while there, but like he had a lot of influence on those guys and how they coached and trained their throwers.
Yeah, he would talk about it a lot when we had because we did have a lot of throwers in there when I was training with weightlifting with him. Tom, if you have while we wind up here, if
Yeah,
you've done just about everything when it comes to strength sports,
except for powerlifting. I've never done a powerlifting meet.
you okay, so you've never done a powerlifting meet, but you've definitely got a strong ass pull, right?
Yeah.
So like, yeah, maybe you haven't done a lot of bench, but you've got a strong squat, you've got a strong. If you were to hop into at your highest, level strength or whatever, I guarantee you would be a nationally qualified immediately power lifter in whatever
Oh,
federation.
yeah. I mean, if I were to do a meet right now, I could total somewhere between like 1,700 and 1,800.
Yeah, so there you go. Out of all the things that you've done, is
Mm-hmm.
there one that you love the most and not like that you think is the best sport or the most efficient or this and that, just the one that like kind of just makes you the happiest that if that you would kind of do all the time if that were the case, or if you could.
If I had better access to abilities to train, Moss wrestling is actually the sport I enjoyed the most.
And that one real
Um,
quick. So for people that don't know that you're
yeah,
basically standing or you're sitting foot to foot in like almost like a seated deadlift position and you're
yep,
grabbing onto this pole with your opponent and it's a direct competition with another opponent. And basically you're just trying to rip it out of their fucking hands. Right.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Which is probably the most manliest sport you could possibly imagine.
It's
Like
it's
it's,
one of the original like ancient sports. Like it's got roots that date all the way back to like the Vikings
it's
to
got to be before wrestling. Like,
it is, yeah. It's got roots like all the way back, like I said before, like a lot of the ancient civilizations used it to test their manhood. The Scots had a version of it, the Vikings had their own version of it, and obviously the Eskimo tribes in Siberia is where the sport like is like originated from. The Native Americans have their own version of it. It
yeah,
was it was it was the funnest one to do. It's
this
just
is my
real,
stick now.
yeah, it's just really hard to train because like you get a guy who said that, oh, I have a 900-pound deadlift, and you'd pull them right over the board because they can't fucking touch their toes. Like that, like
Yeah.
they don't realize that their 900-pound deadlift starts at their shins, and this deadlift actually starts at your toes.
Yeah.
So it's
It's
just like,
deficits. It's deficits for
oh,
sure.
100%, yeah.
That's awesome. I'm surprised that you said that. I thought you were going to say Highland Games. But yeah, I mean, it makes sense. It's the most simple. It's definitely the most specific sport. I mean, it's just a one thing, I mean, it's like, I would almost figure that would be in some of these other sports, like in the Highland Games, but
They complain too much about
yeah,
carrying, pulling their
mobility.
hand. Strongman has tried incorporating it a bunch of times, and everybody complains about their pulling their hamstring
Yeah. Oh, I could think about that. Yeah.
because all they
All
got,
right, brother.
all they got to do is stretch.
Yeah. Right. Just don't pull a hammy, just be a little bit more supple.
A little bit.
But thank you for coming on, man. We're gonna have you
No
on here
problem.
again. I'm sure or maybe we'll see you back on the Better Than Broadway.
Yeah, absolutely.
Make sure you guys check out Tom Stroke on Instagram. You are Stroke of Strength,
No,
SROKA.
strength coach Soroka.
Strength Coach Stroke. I'm sorry about that.
No,
Yeah.
you're good. You're good.
All
I
right,
appreciate it,
man.
man. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. We'll see you.
Yes, sir.